Napoleon Bonaparte marched into Russia with over 600,000 soldiers, the largest European army ever assembled. Fewer than 100,000 would return, most unfit for battle. What began as a campaign for glory became a nightmare of starvation, freezing, and relentless attacks. The Grande Armée, drawn from 20 nations, seemed invincible, but Russia would test them like never before. Instead of a decisive battle, they faced General Winter and General Famine, enemies deadlier than any soldier. Napoleon's ambition drove him to risk everything, believing he could conquer even the vast Russian landscape. But the march to Moscow would humble him and devastate his army. This is the story of how ambition led to ruin, and how even the greatest leaders can be undone by forces beyond their control. The echoes of 1812 still shape history today. Let's follow the footsteps of the Ghost Army. Napoleon Bonaparte, born on the rugged island of Corsica, began life far from the centers of European power. His early years were marked by ambition and a restless drive to rise above his humble origins. Through sheer determination and military brilliance, he rose from obscurity to become Emperor of France, crowned in a ceremony that stunned the world and signaled a new era for Europe. His military genius and relentless ambition made him master of Europe, as he led his armies to victory after victory, reshaping the continent with every campaign. At home, Napoleon reformed laws, built roads and bridges, and brought order to a nation once torn by revolution. His vision extended beyond the battlefield, touching every aspect of French society. Yet his relentless wars brought chaos and suffering to the continent, leaving cities in ruins and families divided by conflict. By 1812, Napoleon controlled most of Europe, his empire stretching from Spain to the borders of Russia, a testament to his extraordinary ambition. But two great powers stood in his way: Britain, ruler of the seas, and Russia, vast and mysterious, both determined to resist his domination. He saw Tsar Alexander I not as a partner, but as a formidable obstacle to his vision of a unified Europe under French rule. Their uneasy alliance soon gave way to suspicion and rivalry. To force Russia into submission, Napoleon devised a bold plan, a swift campaign to march on Moscow, win a decisive battle, and compel the Tsar to yield to his will. It was a strategy that had brought him glory before, as his armies had triumphed across Europe, toppling kings and redrawing borders. But Russia was different. Its vast distances, brutal winters, and fiercely resistant people posed challenges unlike any he had faced. Napoleon's ambition demanded nothing less than total control, setting the stage for his greatest gamble and the most perilous campaign of his career. He believed victory was inevitable, convinced that his genius and the might of his army would overcome any obstacle. But the Russian campaign would test every limit of his power, as his soldiers faced hunger, exhaustion, and the merciless cold. The fate of Europe hung in the balance, as nations watched anxiously, uncertain whether Napoleon's star would rise higher or fall at last. Napoleon's confidence would soon meet its match. The march east began, and with it, the most dramatic chapter of his reign was about to unfold. Unable to invade Britain, Napoleon waged economic war through the continental system, blocking British trade across Europe. For this blockade to succeed, every nation, including Russia, had to comply. Russia's economy suffered, and by 1810 Tsar Alexander quietly resumed trade with Britain. Napoleon saw this as betrayal, threatening his entire strategy. Personal trust between Napoleon and Alexander collapsed, making war inevitable. The invasion of Russia was about more than territory. It was about enforcing Napoleon's will and crushing defiance. He aimed to force Russia back into the blockade, reassert dominance in Eastern Europe, and deliver a blow so devastating the Tsar would never challenge him again. The Grande Armée was assembled for a campaign that would decide the fate of the continent. Diplomacy had failed, only war remained. Napoleon believed he could dictate peace on his terms, but Russia would not yield so easily. The march to Moscow began. In June 1812, Napoleon's Grande Armée, over 600,000 strong, crossed into Russia. It was the largest force Europe had ever seen, a seemingly unstoppable river of men, horses, and artillery stretching as far as the eye could see. The crossing of the Niemen River marked the beginning of an audacious campaign, one that Napoleon believed would bring him swift victory and force the Tsar to his knees. Less than half were French. The rest came from across his empire. Poles, Italians, Germans, Dutch, and even Spaniards marched under Napoleon's banners, drawn from every corner of Europe. This was not just a French army, but a coalition of nations, united by Napoleon's ambition and the promise of glory, or at least, the hope of survival. The logistics were overwhelming. Feeding and moving such a force through the Russian wilderness was nearly impossible. Endless columns of supply wagons creaked along muddy roads, while soldiers and animals alike struggled with exhaustion and hunger. The further they marched, the more the land itself seemed to resist them. The summer was brutally hot and dry. Disease and thirst claimed thousands before a single battle. Men collapsed from sunstroke, and water was scarce. The relentless march under the burning sun sapped the strength of even the hardiest veterans, and the sick were left behind, unable to keep up. The Russian army, led by General Barclay de Tolly, refused open battle, retreating and burning everything behind them. Villages, crops and supplies were set ablaze, leaving nothing for the invaders but smoke and ruin. This scorched earth policy left the French with nothing, no food, no shelter, only ashes. The countryside became a wasteland, and the army's hopes of living off the land vanished with every burning field. Morale plummeted as the army marched through a wasteland, their numbers shrinking daily. Hunger, fatigue, and despair gnawed at the men, and discipline began to break down as the hardships mounted. Napoleon grew frustrated. He was used to quick victories, but the Russians refused to fight on his terms. Each day without battle was a blow to his pride and a test of his army's endurance. The French won territory, but it was empty and useless. Towns were deserted, fields barren, and the people gone. There was nothing to conquer but silence and ruin. The true enemy was the land itself. The vast, unforgiving Russian landscape stretched endlessly ahead, indifferent to the suffering of men and empires. The clock was ticking, winter was coming. Each passing day brought the threat of cold closer, and the army's window for victory was rapidly closing. The further they advanced, the weaker they became. Every mile cost lives, and the once mighty Grande Armée was slowly being worn down by the land and the elements. The Russians drew them deeper, waiting for the right moment to strike. Hidden in the forests and shadows, they watched and waited, letting the invaders exhaust themselves. The trap was being set. Napoleon's army, so confident at the start, was now marching into the heart of a vast and deadly snare, with no turning back. The scorched earth policy devastated Napoleon's army. Every village was a ruin, every field burned. There was nothing to eat. Hunger and disease spread. Men ate their dying horses to survive. The psychological toll was immense, marching through endless emptiness, stalked by an invisible enemy. Discipline broke down, desertion soared. Russian commanders, especially Barclay de Tolly, prioritized saving their army over defending land. Even the capture of Smolensk brought only more ruins and retreating Russians. Napoleon faced a choice: stop and winter at Smolensk, or gamble everything on taking Moscow. His ambition pushed him forward. The army, already decimated, pressed on. The Russians continued to retreat, sacrificing land for time. The final push to Moscow began. Under pressure, the Russians finally made a stand at Borodino, 70 miles from Moscow. On September 7, 1812, the two armies clashed in one of history's bloodiest battles. For 12 hours, the fighting was relentless. Infantry, cavalry, and artillery locked in brutal combat. The French captured key positions but suffered horrific losses. Over 70,000 men fell in a single day. Napoleon technically won, but the Russian army withdrew intact. The victory was hollow. The Grande Armée was battered and exhausted. Kutuzov, the Russian commander, chose to abandon Moscow to save his forces. The road to Moscow was open, but Napoleon's army was a shadow of its former self. The decisive victory he needed had slipped away. The trap was closing. Moscow awaited, but not as Napoleon imagined. On September 14, 1812, Napoleon entered Moscow at the head of his Grande Armée, expecting a triumphant surrender and the spoils of a great city. He believed the Russian capital would offer shelter, supplies, and a symbol of his dominance over the Russian Empire. Instead, he found a city eerily silent and abandoned. The streets were empty, the houses deserted, and the people had vanished, taking with them anything of value. That very night, flames erupted across Moscow. Russian patriots, refusing to let their city fall into enemy hands, set fire to their own homes and buildings, determined to deny the French any comfort or advantage. The city, built mostly of wood, became an inferno. For days the fires raged, consuming 2/3 of Moscow and leaving behind only smoldering ruins and choking smoke. Warehouses filled with food, ammunition, and winter supplies were destroyed. What should have been Napoleon's greatest prize was reduced to ash and rubble, offering nothing but hardship. Napoleon waited in vain for 5 long weeks, hoping Tsar Alexander would surrender. But the Tsar refused to negotiate, leaving Napoleon isolated and increasingly desperate. The occupation quickly turned into a disaster. With no food, no shelter, and the harsh Russian winter approaching, the French soldiers suffered terribly. Napoleon and his army were now trapped deep in enemy territory, far from home, their numbers dwindling and their morale shattered. Staying in Moscow meant certain starvation and death, but retreating meant facing a perilous journey through hostile lands and the deadly cold. With no other option, Napoleon finally gave the order to retreat on October 19th, beginning one of the most harrowing marches in military history. The dream of a glorious victory had turned into a nightmare of defeat and despair. The battered Grande Armée began its desperate march west, leaving behind the ruins of Moscow and the hopes of conquest. The Russian campaign had reached its breaking point, and the true ordeal was only just beginning. For Napoleon and his men, the worst was yet to come. The retreat from Moscow became a nightmare of cold, hunger, and death. Early snows and brutal temperatures struck. Soldiers wore rags and broken boots. Frostbite, starvation, and relentless Russian attacks decimated the army. The once mighty Grande Armée became a desperate mob, abandoning cannons and burning equipment for warmth. The Berezina River crossing was chaos. Thousands drowned or were killed as the French tried to escape encirclement. By December, fewer than 100,000 survivors staggered out of Russia. Only a fraction were still able to fight. Napoleon himself fled ahead to Paris, leaving his shattered army behind. The legend of his invincibility was destroyed in the Russian snows. The campaign had become a symbol of disaster. Europe would never be the same. The Russian campaign marked the beginning of Napoleon's downfall. The loss of the Grande Armée inspired Europe to rise against him. Prussia and Austria joined Russia in a new coalition. Outnumbered and weakened, Napoleon suffered defeat at Leipzig, and was forced to abdicate in 1814. Exiled to Elba, he would return for one last gamble at Waterloo, but his empire was finished. The 1812 invasion changed Europe's map and proved that even the greatest armies can be destroyed by geography, climate, and national will. Russia emerged as a major power. France's dominance was broken. The story of 1812 became a warning to future invaders, most famously, Hitler in 1941. Napoleon's march to Moscow is a timeless lesson in ambition, hubris, and the limits of power. It reminds us of the terrible cost of war and the resilience of nations. For more incredible stories from history, subscribe to our channel.